work.
So, Ricardo, there's a lot that's striking in that. We're going to want to come back to a couple of those themes. But one thing that struck me in all this is that in our words, as I think about innovation, it sounds like Bluffton, yes, they were in the black, if you will, but they couldn't keep up with the costs of sustaining innovation. The investments needed to remain competitive, attractive, and the like for continuous improvement. And heck, they knew that there was a lot of deferred maintenance that they needed to do that they just weren't attending to. And Jeff and I were talking about this after the interview, and we just couldn't believe, though, the timeline that this process takes over, how long it takes. It just seems crazy. And I guess first a reflection for me off that, which was a couple seasons ago, we had some folks on who had healthcare backgrounds. And what became clear, I think, in that conversation was that in the absence of financial incentives to merge a la healthcare, an analogous sector off into higher ed, and then you couple that with this timeline, it almost feels like a wonder that any colleges merge like this proactively or, before it's too late, if you will. And so I'd love to just get your reflections around that and perhaps the lengthiness, if you will, of the merger process, because that could really sink a school that's maybe struggling and having to go through all of that. And so maybe you'll convince me otherwise. Is there any upside in how long this takes? And if not, what would you do differently?
Healthcare has been has an experience with mergers, acquisitions, closures for a long period of time. And in that case, there is a tremendous amount of feelings about this. There's a culture, there's a community. People are angry that their hospital in their region closed, et cetera. So there is emotions running, but it's not the same level and not the same kind of commitment that one has to a institution of higher education, right? There's not alumni of a hospital, right? And so on and so forth. And most people that are employed by a hospital can find jobs very readily, right? Higher healthcare is in high demand. So there's similarities and differences. But I think the question really of when is something that plagues all of these discussions. I try to tell schools and school leaders that they need to start planning ahead. They need to begin to factor in strategic restructuring, whether it be an acquisition or a merger or even a planned closure, these kind of things, well before they actually think they need to do it. I mean, just because you strategize around it, just because you think about it, just because you become familiar with it, just because you understand the facts, doesn't mean you have to do it. But what happens is if you do not think about it and you don't present it in your strategic planning and you don't talk about it, then you're blindsided when you need to do this. Okay? So you need to begin to engage in the conversation well in advance of actually even presenting the option in advance. The other thing, and I think this is really to Jane's credit, leading Bluffton, is she understood where the numbers were going and she understood what the environment is. I mean, there are three things in higher ed environment today that we need to accept. One, there's massive excess capacity, right? There's about 5 million undergraduate slots that are in excess, that we could train another 5 million undergraduates in with exactly the resources we have. Now, that doesn't take into account the geographic mobility and all these kind of things, which are important, right? Many students want to go to institutions close to home. The second fact is that the costs are rising. The costs of doing business in higher education, keeping up with AI, keeping up with online, just meeting regulatory demands, et cetera, are going up, right? There is not just the inflationary factor, it's a lot of other costs. The third thing that we have to understand is that in the end, the demographics don't lie. There's only so many people that are going to want to go to school, and forget the fact that actually higher education is being devalued politically and otherwise. That's another factor. But the reality is there are just less people that need to go to college, right? We've talked before about how many individuals in our nation need to have a 4-year higher education degree. And if we do the math, probably around 45% of the population needs to have a 4-year higher education degree. The rest can have certificates and all sorts of other kind of education. Because in the end, when you and I say, okay, this week the people that I need the most are my plumber, my mechanic, my electrician, my HVAC person, those are the people you really need. You don't actually say, I think today I need a PhD. No, it doesn't. So we have to be realistic, those of us in higher education, that A, this is not about training the entire world in a 4-year higher education degree. And B, this is not about really understanding that the demand is going to go up. Demand, very likely, will continue to decline.
So, Ricardo, just two quick questions then, as we start to wrap up here. One is, it sounds like your point of view is we need a lot more of this, right, in the environment. So, what needs to happen on the regulatory side, on the state side? Obviously, a number of things probably need to happen, but is there one lever that you would pull to try to either encourage these or make these move faster?
So for starters, a lot of the regulatory burden currently on mergers, this business of slowing down mergers, two-step process and so on, is clearly slowing down the ability of institutions to merge because A, you're going to need to keep these institutions alive and financially viable with their own OPEID number for a much longer period of time. But the flip side is this. If you're the government and you say lots of these schools are taking federal dollars and Pell Grants, et cetera, and they're not really performing at the level that they need to be, and they really don't have the capacity to provide the services that they should, so maybe they should close. So maybe we should do a stress test, much like we do with banks and much like we do with other institutions. Maybe we should do put them under stress. They close, God be with them, kind of thing. The problem with that, of course, is that it tends to be clear, or at least tends to be of value if you're a government, right, trying to reduce waste, if you would, but it isn't the best for students. So that's where actually having incentives for schools and leaders to say, listen, you're going to end up closing, your numbers don't look good. Why don't you start planning on closures now? And that's where the regulator, the regionals, should actually step up. And that has been an area where the regional accreditors have not stepped up. They're not willing to tell institution, you know what, you're going to be closing. So let's start planning.